The encryption can be configured on the per VLAN or per radio basis. However, what you have to keep in mind is that you cannot mix and match. What I mean by that is that if you have VLANs, they will be associated to a radio interface. And that radio can only have one single encryption type, which means that if you have VLANs and two VLANs connect to the same radio, those two VLANs on which you're going to configure encryption will have to have the same encryption mechanism. If you do configure different encryption mechanisms on two VLANs that connect to the same radio, what is going to happen is that when you're going to try to enable a radio, that radio is not going to come up because the system is going to try to decide what encryption mechanism should be used there and will have an incompatibility between the two designs that you set. So it's important to keep that in mind. One single type of encryption per radio. Let's go and do it. Remember how encryption was associated to the radios just a minute ago? Now that I have VLANs, you see that I don't see the radios anymore in my encryption manager page. What I see is a VLAN, which means that now my VLAN is going to be associated to the encryption and vice versa. But keep in mind that the radio is still underlying behind the VLAN. So if I configure encryption for VLAN 31 on one of the radios, I need to have the same encryption for all other SSIDs that will be using the same radio. And if I configure some encryption in VLAN 23, it has to be consistent with what is in VLAN 31 just because they are both on the same 5 GHz radio as well. So keep that in mind. The radio has one encryption scheme. Then, as you see in this page, we have many schemes: non, web encryption, and cipher. The only one really you want to use is AES CCNA. All the others are historical possibilities coming from the old days. This one, for example, encryption keys, this is web. So you don't want to use it. It's web. It used to be there and it's still there for backward compatibility. But there is no reason today why you would define a web key. Web, by the way, is a bit confusing in this interface because you have it twice. You have web encryption and you have it here as well in cipher. So web encryption is when you design a static key for web, and cipher is when you may be using dynamic web key obtained from 802.1x encryption. But it doesn't matter because in both cases, you don't want to use it. You want to use AES CCNA, maybe in some cases with backward compatibility with WPAV1, but AES CCNA is the right way to go. And as you do so, you have a choice to use what we call broadcast key rotation. So what this is that you remember the access point with WPAV2 is going to send the group key, group temporal key, GTK, to each client. What you configure here is if you want that key to change every now and then. You can check enable rotation and you can choose an interval in seconds after which you want to change that key no matter what happens in the cell. Even if your number of clients doesn't change, if there is no new client or no client leaving the cell, you can decide on a maximum interval after which you want to change that key always. And if you change that key, you can also check other options to change the key when somebody leaves the cell, that's membership termination, or when somebody reassociates with different capabilities, different speed or something like that. You can add those options when you choose to rotate the key. All right, I have my encryption AES CCNA for my VLAN 31. Let's do the same for VLAN 23. But what would happen if I chose something else? Well, no, technically I could on the graphical interface choose something else, like this one, for example. And if I click apply, the system is going to take my command because that's what I'm configuring. And it's not going to throw an error message at this point. However, I will have a problem the minute I will try to enable the interface, the radio interface, because I will have two incompatible encryption schemes on the same radio. And the result is that my radio is not going to come up. So that's not something which is very intuitive because the AP is not going to tell you. But you should keep that in mind. VLANs associated to the same radio should have the same encryption mechanism. So let's go back to AES CCNA and then move on.